Hello, and a very warm welcome to St Peter Mancroft Church for our Wednesday lunchtime reflection today. If you're visiting the church, you're very welcome to carry on looking around. My name's Gill Persicke. I'm one of the licensed lay ministers here, and my subject for today is what's in a name. And I've decided to talk about names today for three different reasons. The first concerns me and my mum, because we both have the same feelings about our names. We both prefer our middle names to our first names. Mum actually acted on this. She was christened Margaret Jean, but decided as a schoolgirl that she didn't really feel like a Margaret, and announced to everyone, her family, her friends, her school, that henceforth she would be Jean. And it stuck. I'll say a little more about the complications which that has caused at the end of this short reflection. I was christened Gillian Herta, and I realised in my early 20s that I've never really felt like a Gillian or even a Jill, which is what most people call me nowadays. Okay, I put up with the name, I answer to it for sure, but it doesn't really feel like me. I far prefer my middle name, Herta, which I inherited from my German grandmother. But the name is spelt H-E-R-T-H-A, like Bertha with the first letter changed. And I realised that English people were pretty much bound to call me Hertha, and that I just couldn't bear. So, Jill it is, and Jill it will remain until my dying day. Does this matter? Well, I'm not losing sleep over it, and Shakespeare had views on this too. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But people in the past and people nowadays do put enormous store by the names they're known by, often to the extent of actually changing them. And I become very interested in why people do this. In my parents' generation, a woman pretty much always took her husband's surname upon marriage. Very few women chose to keep their maiden name. And it would have been unheard of for a man to take his wife's surname, which does indeed happen today, particularly in the States. People, of course, change their names occasionally by deed poll, because they want something more distinctive, perhaps, or if their original name happens to be a bit embarrassing in some way. And there are reasons for changing your name which have a very modern, a very sort of contemporary feel about them. Transgender people who change their name to reflect their gender identity. People who want their name to emphasize or perhaps to downplay their ethnic identity. There are even people who change their name in order to promote a fervently held political belief. A passionate animal activist, originally called Chris Garnett, changed his name, would you believe it, to KentuckyFriedCruelty.com. And then, of course, there are the religiously inspired name changes. I remember vividly the publicity when the boxer Cassius Clay changed his name to Muhammad Ali, both to mark his conversion to Islam and to signal his allegiance with the rather controversial Nation of Islam movement in America. And my second reason for talking about names today is that last Sunday I preached on a man who started life called Joseph. But the early Christians, the apostles, changed his name to Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. And they did this to reflect his wonderfully encouraging nature. There's a lot of name changes in Scripture, of course, and they always reflect something profound about the person receiving the new name. Abram becomes Abraham, the man destined to be the father of many nations. Jacob becomes Israel, the man who has wrestled with God. In the New Testament, Simon becomes Peter, the rock on which the Christian church is to be built. I found a beautiful quotation in an article about names on a Jewish website, which said this, I quote, "In our name lies our soul and our self." For Jewish people, identity is intimately tied up with the name which a person has been given. Which brings me to my third reason for talking about names. I came across a poem, a very moving little poem by the contemporary English poet Wendy Cope. It's called Names, and it traces the course of a whole life by the names a woman is called by. So, the poem Names by Wendy Cope. She was Eliza for a few weeks when she was a baby, Eliza Lily. Soon it was changed to Lil. Later she was Miss Stewart in the baker's shop, and then my love, my darling, mother. Widowed at 30, she went back to work as Mrs. Hand. Her daughter grew up, married and gave birth, and now she was Nana. "Everybody calls me Nana," she would say to visitors, and so they did, friends, tradesmen, the doctor. In the geriatric ward, they used the patients' Christian names. Lil, we said, or Nana. But it wasn't in her file, and for those last bewildered weeks, she was Eliza once again. I find that very touching, particularly because of my mum and the complications around her name. At the care home where she now lives, the staff are just great at calling her Jean, or even Jeannie, which sounds so affectionate. But when I've taken Mum to the hospital or to the dentist or the solicitor, she's always initially called Margaret because of what they have written in front of them. She's called Margaret until I put them right. Now, I hope Mum never has to go into hospital, but if she does, I will move mountains to make sure she's called by the name she chose for herself and has been known by all her life. So perhaps I'm realizing that our names do matter to us, and sometimes in some circumstances they matter a great deal. But I want to end with a tiny bit of God talk, based on a verse from the prophet Isaiah, which most Christians will know and perhaps love. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I shall be with you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned." Words of the deepest comfort and reassurance, words written originally to sustain the whole people of Israel, but which nowadays we tend to read very personally as words spoken directly to you or to me. And for me, they suggest that God knows our real name, our essential name, not even Barnabas or Herta or Muhammad Ali or whatever, but a name which does encompass our very soul and self. With that in mind, I take comfort that even if we have nobody left to tell the hospital which name we prefer, we are known to God, precious to God, protected to the end of our days by God. Thank you for joining me for this reflection today.